Welcome to Beyond the Crucible, the podcast that dares to talk about setback and failure, but not so we can commiserate, but so we can elevate. I'm Gary Schneeberger, the co-host of the show, and our mission today is to offer you the hope that your crucible experiences, those tragedies and challenges you faced or are facing, don't define you. They refine you. They did not happen to you. They happened for you. And it's an especially resonant message right now because we are in the midst of what we're calling our second act significance series. Stories of people who have gone through a first act in life that for whatever reason, maybe it was a dead end, maybe it was unfulfilling, maybe there was a crucible that upset it. There was a first act, there was an intermission, and now they're in the second act. And in that second act, they have found significance. And few people I know live up to that description of second act significance, as well as the host of the show and the founder of Crucible Leadership, Warwick Fairfax.
Well, thanks so much. Really looking forward to it. And having Robert on, it should be fun.
Robert is our guest today, Robert Miller. He's a musician who had a youthful dream to become a rock star. That sounds like first act stuff. He came from a musical family and came of age during the British invasion era of the 1960s. He played in rock bands through high school, studied bass with John Coltrane's bassist. That's a pretty good study. And became a mainstay of the Boston music scene in the 1970s. He was sure that he was on the track to stardom in music. But like many people, life then got in the way of his dream. Marriage, kids, job, obligations. He thought he could work a day job and play music at night, but that became impossible. He actually stopped playing music altogether for 16 years. One day, though, he woke up and realized that his dream had slipped away. And I'll stop talking about that because it's far more interesting coming from Robert. Warwick, take it away.
Well, thanks again, Robert, for coming on. I really appreciate having you here. So, Robert, I'm just fascinated by just your whole story and, following your dream after 60, which is somebody who's hit that benchmark myself. I think it gives a lot of us hope. So thank you. Life isn't over at 60. It's not time to plan your funeral. It's just not quite yet. There is more to life, and love the band Project Grand Slam. And again, is your podcast, Follow Your Dream. But tell us a bit about the origin story of Robert Miller. And I guess you must have had this love of music in your family, I'm guessing. So where did that come from, this love of music?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the podcast. I appreciate it. Yes, I was born into, I guess you would say, a musical family. My father played the trumpet, although he didn't do it full time. He had a day job, and he played trumpet on the weekends, weddings, bar mitzvahs, private parties, things like that. But right from the get-go, my parents decided that I was going to learn music. So when I was about 5 years old, they started me on piano because that's kind of the mothership. And, I was taking lessons, but when you're 5 years old, who wants to practice, right? So about a year later, I said to my parents, that's it. I don't want to play anymore. And they said, okay, that's fine, but you got to pick another instrument. So I chose the trumpet because that was my father's instrument. And I continued to play the trumpet throughout junior high school and high school. But then there was an event that took place in the midst of all of that. This little band from Liverpool came around, and suddenly it wasn't very cool to play the trumpet anymore. So I taught myself the guitar, and then I taught myself the bass, and I had my high school rock and roll band and all of that stuff. And like you were saying in the introduction, I was on track. I was going to be the next rock star because that's just what I wanted to do with my life. Around the age of 19 or so, I did have that experience of studying for a brief amount of time with John Coltrane's bass player, Jimmy Garrison, and he introduced me to jazz. And at that time, I went back to school. I had taken some time off from college. I went back to school in Boston, and I completed my degree. I had a degree in broadcasting and film, which at the time meant absolutely nothing because it didn't give me entree to any kind of meaningful job. But I did get a job finally in the mailroom of the public television station in Boston. And I had an ideal life. I was doing the mailroom during the day and I was playing music at night. I loved it. There was only one problem. I wasn't making enough to sustain a human life. Okay. I mean, I was making maybe $100 a week. It was terrible. And I was so depressed about it. And in a moment of severe weakness, a friend of mine said to me, well, why don't you go to law school? And I said, law school? Why would I ever want to do that? And he said, well, you're playing in a band with a guy who's a medical doctor, which is true. He had come over from South Africa and he was playing music. He was doing medicine during the day. He was playing music at night. We had a great band. We played all over the Boston area. And he said, you could be just like him. I said, oh, I thought about it for about a nanosecond. Okay. I was a 20-year-old idiot. And I said, okay, that sounds great. So I went, I applied to law school, and unfortunately I got into law school. And then once you go to law school, people that haven't been there don't understand. It's all encompassing. I mean, it was 23 hours a day. I didn't have any time to even think about music while I was there. And then unfortunately I did well enough in law school that I got a job afterwards as a lawyer. And that became my 16-year or so hiatus that you guys talked about earlier, because my dream was to do law during the day and play music at night. I mean, that's what I wanted. That was my dream, and I was going to do it successfully. But there's that expression, the law is a jealous mistress, which means that I was working in the law for 23 hours a day. I was trying to sleep for about 1 hour a night. I was married. I had a child. I had a mortgage. I had obligations. And my dream just flew out the window. I mean, and I was miserable. I really was. I mean, this whole period when I wasn't playing, I kept saying, when am I going to get it back? What happened here? This wasn't what I was planning for. And finally, when I was in my 40s, I took the first steps towards realizing that dream.
I mean, that's an incredible story. Unfortunately, yeah, somebody recommends law. I mean, that's not like a 40-hour-a-week job. I mean, it's
40 hours a day.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and unfortunately, as you put it, you were too successful. So the fact that you were successful was unfortunate in that sense.
Right.
It's like, please fire me. Somebody fire me. Put me out of my misery. But I'm fascinated as since your first love was playing the trumpet, do you ever think if you grew up in, the late 30s or 40s in the era of, Glenn Miller and Artie Shaw and whoever it was, you could have been a big band leader playing the trumpet, in another life, because then
Sure.
it would have been cool to play the trumpet then, right?
Absolutely. And that's exactly the music that my father loved. He was into big bands. And of course, I listened to all of that because they were being played in the house all the time. And my father and I used to play duets on the trumpet. In fact, when I met the woman that became my wife, on our first date, I brought her home and my father and I played duets on the trumpet for her. And she didn't leave.
Married you yeah, I was going to say she married you anyway. Wow, that's awesome.
Well, I don't know. It'd be a whole other conversation, but you ever thought of somehow there's got to be a way in Project Grand Slam of just bringing a trumpet in and just for the heck of it? I mean, you can play jazz, fusion, whatever with the trumpet. It's probably been a while, but wouldn't that be kind of cool? Yeah,
it's funny you mention that because there was a song and I said to myself, I think I got a trumpet part for this song. And I started to practicing. I hadn't practiced in, 100 years. I started practicing a little bit. I brought the trumpet in and I said to the guys in the band, when we reached the point in this song, I said, I'm going to play this little lick on the trumpet. And I played it and they all said, maybe we'll find some other way to do this.
Well, at least they didn't say, let's find somebody else. That would be...
No, they were too cool for that, but they let it be known that this was not the best way to go forward.
Oh, well, another time. So, yeah, I mean, just to go back a bit, I mean, you started off in the mailroom in the public TV station, which maybe didn't affect you, but I think of WGBH in Boston as being the flagship of, PBS in the
Yep.
U.S. It produces some of the highest quality programs. But again, it's obviously maybe that wasn't your journey. And then you go to law school. And once you start down a path, I mean, how did it feel day in, day out? You were probably making decent money, paying the mortgage, being the responsible father, which is, I guess, is what we're meant to be, right? Responsible fathers.
Right.
Responsible. That's sort of the mantra, if you will,
Yep.
And so you were doing that. As the decades wore on, I mean, you unfortunately, to put it, being successful, but how did that feel within you?
Well, as I said, I was very frustrated, very conflicted, because on the one hand, I had a life, that was working for my family, but it wasn't satisfying the urge, the dream that I always had inside of me. And what started me down the path that finally got me where I wanted to go, I discovered by accident. I was living in New York City, and there was a place there at the time. I call it a musician's dating service. Okay. It wasn't actually a dating service, but you went down to this place, and you told them, this is the kind of music I want to play. So if you said Led Zeppelin, album 2, side 1, they would find 3 other idiots that wanted to play that music with you. And that's what I did. And for about 6 months, that's how I started to get back into playing again. Every week I would go down there, and it caused me to start practicing again. I was rusty as could be, of course, but that got me back into music. And then I discovered another point of luck, that a childhood friend of mine had a recording studio in New York City. And I rang him up, and the next thing I knew, he was saying, well, why don't we do an album? And I was scared to death because I hadn't done anything like that before. But he assembled a group of very professional musicians to work on material that I finally had put together. And the first album that I ever did came out of that. So that started me down the path. And then I took some of those guys and I formed a band, and we started to play festivals and clubs within New York City. But it was still more like an avocation, more like a hobby, because I was still working as a lawyer, and I had that one life, but I had this other life that was coming, into play more and more. So I was headed down the right path, but it wasn't really what I had always dreamed I would be doing.
And how
I've
old were
always
you?
wanted.
Go
Oh,
ahead.
so
I was just going
I've
to say,
always wanted. No, no, go ahead, Warwick.
I just wanted to get the timeline here. How old were you at the moment, when this was happening, this sort of dual life?
I was probably around 40.
Got it.
Okay.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead, Gary.
I've wanted to ask guests ever since we started this series. Right? It's called Second Act Significance, and implicit in that title is that perhaps the first act maybe felt insignificant. I know it didn't feel like your dream, but did you feel at some point, was there any level of, I mean, you're working as a lawyer, you're raising a family, you have a quote unquote good life, but did you feel a lack of significance in what you were doing? Was that an emotion you had?
It was more like schizophrenia, okay? Because on the one hand, I had this life, as you said, that was working on certain levels. Okay, I could pay my bills. I had a family, so all of that was very nice. But I believe that everybody starts out life with a dream. And usually when we're younger, the dreams are pretty big. Okay. Very few people start out life when they're 10 years old saying, my dream is to become an accountant. Okay. Their dream is to become an astronaut, a baseball player, a rock star, things like that. And I had this dream from an early age that I wanted to become a rock star. I wanted to play music with all the guys that I grew up and they were my heroes. And so I did have this burning desire, and it was always there that I wasn't doing exactly what I wanted to do. And the question became, was there ever a time and a place and a method where I could start to gravitate towards that? And it took me a long time. I mean, I talked about coming back into music at age 40. I didn't get to the point where I was doing music full time until, as we said earlier, I passed 60. That was 20 years later.
I mean, that's amazing. I may be misquoting it, but I think there's a quote by Thoreau talking about, smoldering discontent. And was there a sense that life was fine, but, maybe it wasn't a forest fire, but there was sort of, I don't know, something smoldering at some level, just in this bifurcated dual life. It was
Here's the
working,
quote: "The
but
mass
not.
of men lead lives of quiet desperation."
There you go. Exactly. That's the one. That is
That
exactly
was
the one.
Thoreau's quote. And you know what?
Yeah.
100% I agree with that. Most
Yeah.
people, what happens, I think, in life, and it certainly happened to me, you have a dream, you have a path, you have a burning desire. Life gets in the way. We don't plan for it. It just happens. And it happens to most of us. Most people don't wind up doing exactly what they dreamt they would be doing when they were younger. Either it wasn't practical, or it wasn't in the cards, or their uncle offered them a job and they went into this, that, or the other thing. Stuff happens. That's the usual case. It's the unusual case of somebody that knows at an early age, this is what I want to do, and they actually do it. So the question then becomes, all right, do you let that dream go? Was it just a youthful fancy of some sort? Or do you pursue it? And frankly, when I decided to jump into the deep end of the pool, I had just passed my 60th birthday. And I said to myself, if I don't do it now, when the heck am I going to do it? As you said before, you're not quite dead when you're 60, but you also know that when it comes to age, you're kind of on the far side of the mountain. Okay. You're not going to be getting any younger. And not to get morbid about the whole thing, you start to have your life pass before your eyes, and you kind of say, all right, if I'm going to do something, if there's really something left that I want to do, when am I going to do it if I don't do it now? And I think the pandemic accentuated that feeling. It did for me, and it did for other people, because all of a sudden we all had to stop, and we weren't doing the kinds of things that we were doing before. And it made people kind of examine their lives and say, am I doing what I want to do? And, it put older people certainly in touch with their mortality, because they said, okay, there's a finite amount of time that we're all on this planet. What do I want to achieve? What do I want to pursue? So it was all of these feelings together that led me to do what I did.
There's one other story before we get to that. In a sense, one of the things you've talked about is you had a crucible, I think in your 40s, a bad accident, and somehow I think that also wove into the story of mortality. And, maybe you didn't trigger the change right then, but it seemed like that's part of your journey with the pivot. So talk about the role that accident had in changing your perspective.
Well, you're right. It was part of my journey, and actually it stopped my journey because I couldn't journey much after that. When I was in my later 40s, I used to be a big bicycle rider in New York City. That's where I was living at the time. And I would go out for these long bike rides on the weekends and the like. And it was on a cold, cold day in December of 2000. It was a Saturday. I went out for a bicycle ride. I went over the 59th Street Bridge, okay, which was immortalized by Simon and Garfunkel, okay? And at that time, at least, once you got over the bridge, you had to do a U-turn onto a service road in order to then come back around and go forward, because I was going out straight ahead from the bridge. Well, I went onto that service road, the U-turn, and unbeknownst to me, there was a van that came up from behind, hit my bicycle. And although I don't know and remember any of this, apparently my bicycle flew backwards several times over the van. I landed on the street, and I was knocked unconscious, of course. The only good thing about it was that the guy that caused the accident stopped and called 911. But here's the moment that I remember. I was lying on my back, and I was coming to, and I hear these two EMS guys hovering over me saying to each other, boy, is this guy lucky. We usually find people like him dead or paralyzed. And I was neither. And they ambulanced me over to a hospital. I found out the difference between an emergency room and a trauma center. Okay. At least in New York City, every borough has one trauma center where they deal with people, gunshot wounds and things like that. Anyway, long story short, it turns out that I had broken my neck. And the only reason that I didn't wind up dead or paralyzed, a la, Christopher Reeve, is because I was phenomenally lucky. My neck exploded and none of the shrapnel hit my cord, my spinal cord. So you have an experience, and I came back from that. I had 8 hours of surgery. I got more metal in my neck than Dones has pills, as we used to say. um, for any of the older people in the audience. But you know what? Since that time, that gave me a tremendous kick in the rear, because I said to myself, not to get too philosophical or religious about it, but I kind of felt like, okay, I was given an extension on my life, and I needed to do something to, make use of that time. And so that was a big push towards the dream of going into music. But again, that took place in my later 40s, and it wasn't until another decade that I finally was able to get to the point that I wanted to get to.
So you hit 60 or thereabouts, and maybe there was a dream, a bit like a little plant that was growing and growing and beginning to push the other life, the lower life aside. Sometimes it takes a while for dreams to bloom and blossom, but finally it poked its head through and got big enough. And I think you've talked about it, but was there a point at which you said, okay, this is it? Laura's fine, but I'm gonna go full on for music. Was there a point at which you said, like, I'm doing it? I'm not going to do
say that there was a specific
bifurcated life anymore. I'm going to do it.
Yeah. Well, there was a point. I mean, again, I can't measure it to the day, but it just got to a point. I had been playing music even since that time I mentioned in the 40s. I got back into it, and so music was in my life, but it wasn't in my life at the level and the extent to which I wanted it to be. And there came a point, as I said, where I decided this is what I want to go for. And I gave everything else up. I dove into the deep end of the pool, so to speak. So the first thing that I did, I sat down and I said, what do I need to do? And I'm a great believer in baby steps. Okay. Because if I said, from a standing start, I want to be playing Madison Square Garden next year, that's ridiculous. That's not going to happen. But I was able to write down the first 5 or so steps on a napkin that I needed to do. I knew I needed to form a band. I needed to write music again. I needed to, start rehearsing with the band. I needed to get gigs with the band, things like that. And this is a true story. I went and I took out an ad on Craigslist, okay, to have like a mass audition to find the members of my band. And lo and behold, about 30 people showed up for this audition. Was in a rehearsal studio in New York City. And from that, I was able to choose the initial people for the band, which I named Project Grand Slam. And that's how it began. And from there, it was one baby step forward, one back, 2 sideways, that kind of a thing. But slowly but surely, I started to make progress. And I saw that this was possible. Okay. Because not every dream, of course, is going to be possible. I actually came up with this acronym called DREAM, DREAM, to explain my theory. Would you like to hear that? Would that be worthwhile?
Yeah. No, that'd be great.
Okay. So D of dream obviously stands for the idea that everybody has to have a dream. And I believe that everybody does have a dream, even if you've been kind of suppressing it for years. The R of dream theory is the dream has to be at least somewhat realistic. Now, I think people could say, well, Miller, you're 60 years old. You're not going to be a rock star at 60. Come on. That wasn't realistic. And you know what? They were probably right. But I thought it was possible. So I said, I'm going to take a shot. Okay. If Mick Jagger can still do it at 75, I can at least take my shot at my age. The E of dream theory for me is what I was just speaking about, execution. And I believe that the way you do that is through an action plan. And the action plan needs to be a series of baby steps, because otherwise it's just too daunting. It's just too big. And the A of the theory is to adjust that plan where necessary, because there's never a plan that goes directly from, square one to your conclusion without some kind of obstacle or hurdle. I like to quote the former heavyweight champion Mike Tyson. He was asked, when you go in the ring, did you have an action plan? He said, yes, every fighter has an action plan until they get hit in the face. Okay. Then you got to adjust it. And the M stands for me for measurement. How do I measure my success? Because not every dream is going to succeed. In fact, I didn't go into this with the idea that it was either going to be, a rock star or everything was a failure. I said to myself, this is what I need to do. This is what I want to do. And as long as I see movement that's kind of moving in the right direction, I'm going to stick with it. But if it ever gets to the point where that's not working, okay, not every dream is going to work out. So that's been my philosophy. And frankly, look, when we started out as a band, there were too many nights when we were basically giving private concerts for the bartender and the waitress, okay? Because it's very hard to establish a following, of course, but we just kept at it. And that's the most important thing is never give up.
The thing I want to make sure listeners hear, and you've heard it throughout this series, and I just want to call it out now, because you've used the phrase a couple of times early on, Robert, when you talked about life sort of just happened to you. And in the first act, I think it's true that sometimes things can just happen to us. We get on a road, and the road, it's almost like one of those automatic walkways. You're just kind of on it, and it keeps tugging you ahead, and you're on the road, and you're fine. So you can get into the first act that can be somewhat unfulfilling or not exactly right, and that can kind of just happen to you. But what you've just described is to get to that second act, to get to that significance, to get to what brings your heart alive. That doesn't just tend to happen to you. You have to act to make that happen. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we tend to, be in a point of stasis where we just continue on with whatever it is that we're doing. It's very hard to kind of motivate yourself to do something else. I recognize that. There's a lot of people that want to do things, but they just can't move themselves in the right direction. But you really have to. You have to say to yourself, the only way I'm going to change whatever it is that I want to change about my life, whether it's my job, my marriage, my hobbies, my situation, you need to take steps. You need to do something. And that's why I said, start with baby steps. Okay. Because that's the way you can take a huge task and break it down into small steps and actually accomplish something.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying, Robert, is so profound, and I want listeners to hear that, is sometimes you think, well, gosh, to pick your example, I'm never going to be Mick Jagger, Paul McCartney, that's not going to happen to me. I'm never going to play Madison Square Garden. So they think of the big dream and they stop. It's all too much. It's all too hard.
Right.
I'm 60, my fingers maybe aren't as nimble as they were in their 20s. It's be a whole list of reasons of why not. You could probably list 100 things of why Robert Miller should not even bother trying. Maybe you went through that list. But what I find interesting is your whole dream methodology, baby steps, dream, realistic, execute, adjust, measurement. You had a plan. Maybe it would change, but you had a plan of, I'm going to, do Craigslist. I'm going to interview a bunch of people. I'm going to take baby steps. I'm not expecting Madison Square Garden. I'm going to be okay if the first few times it's just bartenders and waitresses. And, as you rightly said, so long as I see a little bit of progress, I'm going to keep moving forward. To me, you had a plan, and almost more importantly than the plan, you had a philosophy of how to start something new that increased your chance of success. So does that make sense? Because I feel like this is more than just your story. There are key lessons for anybody who wants to start a second act with your methodology.
Well, there's either lessons or there's a lot of stupidity in what I did. But all I can say is that's the way I have to go. I needed to go forward. Okay. And I kind of do this with everything in my life. I decide if there's something I want to do, I come up with a plan of sorts, and I figure out a pathway. And not everything works out. I hasten to add that all the time, because people think, well, if you go after something, if you go after that brass ring and you don't get the brass ring, you've been a failure. And that's a terrible way to look at things. For me, the question was always, I would feel terrible. I would feel regret, which I never wanted to feel, if I didn't take my shot. And I think that's the most important thing for people in life. Whatever it is that drives you, you want to be able to look back and say, I took my best shot. If it works, fabulous. If it didn't work, you gave it your best try. No regrets.
Absolutely. We've had other people on the podcast say something very similar, that failure is not succeeding. Failure is not taking the shot. Failure is not trying. I've heard multiple people who've achieved amazing things who've said, so long as I tried and gave it my best, that was my definition of success, whether it succeeded or not.
Almost everybody that succeeds has failed before they succeed. I had the guy on my podcast that is the president of WD-40, the miracle product that cleans up any squeaks and any problems you have with anything. Well, they named it WD-40 because it failed 39 times before they got to the 40th iteration. Keep that in mind.
That is,
and remember, in light of Gary, in light of your Beatles T-shirt, that 17 record labels passed on the Beatles.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Wow.
How smart were those guys?
Not very smart and not very rich when the time was
That's right.
Yeah.
done.
No, that is.
So, there's always going to be failures. There's always going to be hurdles. There's always going to be people saying this won't work. This can't work. You're too old. You're too stupid. You're too this. You're too that. The heck with them. Okay. Take your best shot.
And your quoting of that, right? Take your best shot. Earlier, you quoted a famous boxer, Mike Tyson. There's another famous boxer who took his best shot, and that's Rocky Balboa. Yep. And he certainly didn't succeed the first time, but he succeeded after that.
There you go.
Yeah, I mean, that is really inspiring, just the mentality of, not everything you're going to do is going to succeed, but, you've got to try, because too many people, they have this burning desire. To me, if you have this burning passion, which you did over decades, that's not just some childhood whim. A childhood whim doesn't last 60 years. It fades. You might have wanted to be an astronaut when you were 12. Typically at 60, you're not still thinking, gosh, I wish I'd been an astronaut. But
well, if you're Richard Branson, maybe you are.
Okay. There you go. There's always an exception. Well said. But for you, that dream was there, and you went for it. So some people, we're both over 60, they kind of have this attitude, gosh, this sense of regret. If only I'd, I'm moderately successful now, and you're more than moderately successful. You're really incredibly successful. But let's say you achieve some moderate level of success. I could have done this at 25 or 35, and why didn't I? I was just too scared, gutless, whatever. What do you say to people that just have this sense of regret? I missed 40 years of my life. Gosh,
Well,
what could I have been? What could I have done? That kind of mentality.
I can't tell you that I don't have those thoughts or didn't have those thoughts. Along the way, it took me a long, long time before I finally got to the place that I wanted to get to. And feelings of regret are some of the worst feelings that you can have. Okay. And very few people, I think, get through life and say, I didn't make any mistake. I have no regrets whatsoever. We all have different regrets that we didn't do something. But again, there's a difference between something that we were precluded from doing or that we had no possibility of doing versus those personal regrets for things that we could have done, but we just didn't do it. And I got to a point in my life where I said, I don't want to feel whenever my life is over that I could have done something that I wanted to do, but I just didn't. Why didn't I do it? Was I afraid of failure? That's usually the reason. I don't want people to laugh at me. I don't want people to think I was a failure. Oh, you took your shot. It was stupid. You shouldn't have done it. Why'd you do it? There's a million reasons why people look down upon others for their success or for their efforts. Who cares? That's, you don't want to be guided in life by those kind of naysayers. I think you just have to follow that North Star that's in you. That's the key. Figuring out what is it that turns you on, that makes you tick, that motivates you. There's going to be something in there. It probably was in there when you were younger. Maybe you suppressed it. But even if it wasn't there then, you got something now, something you always wanted to do. It was a hobby. It was I just read, for example, this is kind of silly, but it points it out. John Travolta just announced that he just got a pilot's license for another huge airliner. Okay. This is what the guy has decided that he wanted to do. He was a successful movie star and singer and all of that. He wanted to become a pilot. And now he's apparently approved for 767s and 737s, and for all I know, the space shuttle he'll be flying next. But that's great. Okay, that's what it's all about.
I mean, I think you might have said that, maybe you weren't ready for it when you're in your 20s. You obviously know who you are far more now, and it's impossible to answer these questions. But, and as some people have said, and I sometimes think, like with my own book, Crucible Leadership, that came out late last year, 2021, and it's like, gosh, would it be nice if I'd been able to write that 20 years earlier, but I wasn't ready for a variety of reasons that listeners have heard on other podcasts. You feel like, in a sense, sometimes, whether that you believe in God or the universe, that there's some divine hand that kind of knows when you're ready. And yeah, that's one of those philosophical conundrums that philosophers have been discussing for centuries. What's the role of divine hand versus free will? And to me, it's both and. How's that possible? I have no idea. But do you feel in some sense that there was this divine hand, maybe you weren't ready and you are ready now, and life happens for a reason, even if we don't understand it, kind of deal?
I completely subscribe to that. I don't know what the force is that causes it, but if I look back and I'm really honest, I would say, okay, why didn't I do something when I was 20? I wasn't ready for whatever reason. Okay. And when I look back now at what I have achieved since I went into this whole thing full time, and it's been meaningful what has been achieved. I've got 11 albums out. I've got 5 million video views, 1 million streams. I've played festivals and concerts around the world. I've got a Billboard #1 album. These are things that if I was really ready for all of that when I was 20, I think I would have done it then. And I didn't do it for a reason. And I can say to myself now, well, it was because life took me in a different direction. But I think that we all kind of push ourselves or orient ourselves towards certain directions. So somewhere along the line, I must have pushed myself in a different direction.
And you look at a lot of these musicians, rock stars over the last decades in their 20s, how many of them have been untouched by their success? Multiple marriages, substance abuse, not all of them, but so many. I mean, it's unknowable to know, could you have been another statistic if you'd achieved the success you have now in your 20s? Now you're ready for it. Now it's not going to, I would assume, go to your head. You're not going to do dumb stuff that hurts you and friends and family. But who's to say what a young Robert Miller? I mean, it's unknowable, but could you, it's like, is there any reason that you could be different than so many and withstood it? Maybe. Maybe you would have been like so many others. It's hard to know.
The thing is, if you take a look at who's out there and really successful in music at an older age, and we've talked about guys like the Rolling Stones and McCartney and Billy Joel, Elton John, all of these guys made it when they were around 20-ish, okay? And they've been carrying on, sometimes on their laurels, for the last 50 years. Mm-hmm. I don't think the Rolling Stones have made a new album in 40 years. Okay. They play the same set list every night. Not knocking it. I'm just saying they established their bona fides and they established their creativity and everything at an early age. And they've been, now they're in their 70s or 80s and still doing it. When I started down this path, people said to me, well, who else do you know that went into this kind of thing when they were past 60? Without having had that background of starting when they were 20. And you know what? The more I did research on this, I couldn't find a single person, not one. And that convinced me even more that I was crazy to do this. But I said, you know what? Somebody's got to do it. And maybe I'll be the first one. So look, I don't want to make it seem like, again, I'm at the top of the heap here. I don't play hip hop. I don't play rap music. I'm not playing the kind of music or writing the kind of music that, 16-year-old kids want. But that's irrelevant to me. We have a worldwide audience now in music and everything because of the internet. So you can always find an audience for what you do almost, anywhere in the world. And so my success has been at a level that I was hoping for. But overall, let's face it, it's still a modest success. It's compared to some of the big names out there. But again, that wasn't my motivating factor.
Again, just so profound. It's easy to compare yourself and say, yeah, is Robert Miller a household name like Mick Jagger or Paul McCartney?
Maybe in my household it is.
There you go. Well, and that's all that matters. That's all that matters. That's so well said. Yeah, I mean, it'd be easy for, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to be, this New York Times bestseller. Maybe it will be one day. I mean, it's definitely a best-selling book, but it's always easy to say, oh, well, there's always somebody better. Like, we often talk about, I love tennis, as people know, and, how many people are going to be, Rafa Nadal, Roger Federer, Novak Djokovic. Very, very few. You could be a great college player. Your chance of being good in the pros is infinitesimally small. So there's always somebody better. There's always somebody that has sold more records, but that's not the point. Is if you're satisfying who you are, and rather than saying, "Oh, I got to do hip hop because that's the way to get more numbers," but if that's not what you want to do, don't do it. Be true to your own soul. Be true to your own passion. And success isn't defined by what other people. It's if you're happy with it, that's all that matters. So I think all of those things are so important. I want to just talk a bit about, I guess, your twin passions. But in this case, those twin passions are working together. Project Grand Slam and Follow Your Dream podcast. It's not this bifurcated life. You love both. It's not like so. Just out of curiosity, why did you call your name your band Project Grand Slam?
Okay, here's the story. When I was naming the band, my first group was called the Robert Miller Group. That was a big surprise, right? And I said, when I was naming this band, I got to do something more creative than that. And I was thinking about what the name could be. And I just kind of thought about the James Bond movies, okay, which I was a big fan of when I was a kid. And one of those great movies was Goldfinger. Okay, 1964, so 65, and it was the plot to steal the gold out of Fort Knox. And I remembered that the plot to steal the gold was called Project Grand Slam. And I said to myself, what a fabulous name for a band. So I named the band Project Grand Slam. 6 months later, I actually watched the movie again. And to my horror, in the midst of the movie, Sean Connery, as James Bond, talks about Operation Grand Slam. Okay. So I remembered it wrong. And I said, oh my God, what am I going to do now? So I went and I Googled Operation Grand Slam, and I found out that there was a nickname for some kind of genocidal program in Africa called Operation Grand Slam. So I said, well, I don't think it would be very cool to name a band after a genocidal program. So I want to stick with Project Grand Slam. So that's how I got the name.
Sounds very fortuitous. And so how would you describe your music again, just for listeners?
My music is it's a fusion of rock and jazz with a twist of Latin thrown in. And as I like to say, a New York City groove.
That's great.
All of my musicians, almost all of them, come from other countries. They have come to New York City because it's a melting pot for musicians. So right now in the band, my singer is from Mexico, my keyboard player is from Venezuela, my guitar player is from Canada, my drummer is from Puerto Rico. They bring not only their youth, their incredible talent, but their enthusiasm and their culture to the music. So, although I was raised in New York City and my father was a big fan of Spanish music, we used to listen to it all the time on the radio. When I had folks in the band with a Latin background, it said to me, I had to work some Latin music into the sound. So that's how the Latin got into that. So it's kind of a fusion. It's a melting pot. It's completely against the grain of what happens in music now. Right now, you're supposed to do one type of music. That's it. You play the same song over and over and over again. You just give it a different name. That's what artists do. And I was completely from a different school. I love variety. I love the idea that you could have different sounds and different influences and have them all reflect in the music. And that's one of the things I said to myself, this is what I'm going to do to be true to myself.
And what I love about what you're saying is be true to yourself. Don't listen to the market mavens in music saying, this is what you got to do to be successful. Have one song and just change a couple chords and, just over and over and over again. It sounds always very similar and it'll be familiar. Oh, it's a Robert Miller song.
That's
I
true.
recognize that. And that's probably makes sense. But the other thing I love is you have such diverse people and themes in your music, and sort of out of diversity, you have a beautiful, to use your word, fusion into a new sound. I think that's maybe a metaphor for a wider discussion, perhaps, of diversity of experience confused together to form something greater, something new. So I think there's also a subtext to what you're doing. It's important for society too, don't you think?
I think that there's the old expression, variety is the spice of life. And I believe that that works in music as well. I love taking chances, doing things that are different, kind of, always pushing the boundaries. Just what I like to do.
So talk about your podcast, because I get Project Grand Slam, and so it's so because I when you said that, I thought, oh, that's right, that's from James Bond, but I didn't really figure out myself that, gosh, it was Operation. But yes, so fortunate that you misremembered. But that makes sense. But it doesn't sound like you had a lifelong dream to do a podcast, because obviously they didn't exist until, I don't know, what, 10, 15 years ago. What made you decide to do that? Because that does feel different. Why a podcast called Follow Your Dream?
Yeah. Well, it wasn't 10, 15 years ago that I was even thinking about podcasts. I didn't even know what a podcast was, honestly, about a year ago. We were in the middle of the pandemic. We had just put out an album in January of 2020 called East Side Sessions. I thought it was a terrific album. We were ready to go out and play behind it. And then, of course, the world locked down and we couldn't play any longer. So the first thing that I did was I said, okay, we're stumped at this moment. Let's take 4 of the songs from the album and let's do some videos, because that we could do. And the first 2 videos were kind of Zoom videos, with everybody in their own little box, like the Hollywood Squares, okay? And we're all lip syncing to the songs. And the third video, we did an animated video of a Beatles song. It's totally obscure Beatles song called I Want to Be Your Man that Ringo sang in A Hard Day's Night.
Excellent.
We changed it to I Want to Be Your Girl because we have a female singer. And then the fourth song that we did the video of is called it's a song called The Partners, and it's my cowboy jazz song. Okay, talk about an unusual combination. I did a song that literally kind of had horses' hooves and whips and 6-gun shooting combined with a jazz kind of a thing, and it's all around it's all around a storyline where you had 2 partners in the Old West that went out and robbed people, and one partner turned into robbed the other partner, and the other partner was getting back at the first partner. And I said to my video guy, how are we going to do a video of this song? He said, let me look around. He somehow found a 1960s spaghetti Western where the plot of the movie kind of fit the storyline of this song. So we put out a video that was, taking the spaghetti Western and putting it to this music, and it actually did very well. This is all leading up to, I needed to do something to keep my creative juices going. I was writing music. We couldn't practice. We couldn't play anywhere. And somebody suggested to me, why don't you think about doing a podcast? And I was very, very dissatisfied with social media as a musician because, you put your music up on YouTube or you put it on Facebook, and it takes absolutely no commitment, no engagement for somebody to hit a like button. So you get all these likes and you get all these comments, and at the end of the day, it doesn't mean anything because there's no real attachment. And somebody said, well, you should look into podcasts because in a podcast, you have a longer form of communication. You can establish a much deeper connection with your audience. And the more I looked into it, the more I said, gee, I think you're right. And because of my background, what I did, I followed my dream. And I thought to myself that there were others out there, many, many others, that would love to follow and perhaps succeed at their dream. So why don't I start a podcast with two goals? One is to inspire and motivate people to follow their dream, whatever that dream might be. And secondly, it was another way for me to introduce my music to a brand new, bigger audience than I had before. So in each episode, I bring into play one of my songs as the featured song, and I try to make it relevant somehow. And I started to interview people that were among the more well-known musicians, but also others that had accomplished their dream. And what's remarkable about the podcast is that it has just spread out in a way that I never anticipated. As we speak today, I have listeners in 191 countries. I mean, that blows me away. There's only 193 countries in the whole world.
Wow.
And somehow or other, people have found me in places that I didn't even know were countries. So that goal has been accomplished as well. The podcast is doing very nicely. I've got great guests. I get my music out there, and I've got listeners all around the whole world.
I mean, that is remarkable. I mean, I love sort of the tagline you have for the podcast. Remember, you're never too old. It's never too late to follow your dream. I'm sure in our society, as you say, especially after COVID, people being shut in, people realizing their mortality, there's a lot of folks that think, gosh, maybe I could do what Robert did. Maybe I'm a musician. Maybe I'm not a musician. But just telling people stories of it's not being too late to pursue your dream. I'm not a massive believer in so-called traditional retirement. Studies show that, if you just sit on the beach or play golf without any purpose, not knocking it, you'll probably die, younger. If you have purpose in life, whatever that means to you, you'll live longer and you'll probably be happier. So, you're preaching life isn't over, at 60, that, it's never too late. So that's a lot of people think it is too late, but that's an important mission. So I think it's ironic that out of COVID, in your case, something good happened. A dream was birthed that may not have been birthed without it. I mean, you're somebody that listens to your inner soul, listens to your passion, and you don't snuff it out. Maybe you chat to some close friends and come up with a plan along your sort of dream, realistic, execute, adjust, measurement deal. So that's, you didn't just do one dream. You did more than one. You did a couple. And they're both
I actually did a third as well, because along the way, after I started the podcast, somebody said to me, why don't you write a book? Your podcast is great, but why don't you do a book? And I said, yeah, what am I going to do? War and Peace or something like that? I'm not an author. So they said, well, why don't you just kind of do it as a memoir? And I said to myself, okay, what can I do that is within my scope? So I put together what I call the Follow Your Dream Handbook. I think I named it Handbook after, remember there was a book a long time ago called the Preppy Handbook.
I do.
Okay. And I always liked that. Handbook, that's pretty cool. And what it said to me was that I could make it kind of part memoir so I can tell my story, but the rest of it would be a how-to. So to try and, tell people, this is how I did it. Maybe it would work for you as well. Here are my steps. I put that dream theory into it. And so in my spare time, I wrote this little book. It's about 100 some odd, 120 pages, something like that. I put in a lot of pictures and stuff like that, to prove to people that I actually was doing what I claimed to be doing. And it went out last August, and lo and behold, it became like an Amazon bestseller on day one. And, it's sitting out there. It's just doing its thing. And so that worked as well.
This is the time in the show when I normally say the captain has turned on the fasten seatbelt sign, indicating we've begun our descent. It's time to land the plane. But because we're talking to a maker of music, I'm going to change that up and say we're at a live show. The band has just fake ended it. It's left the stage for that moment where we all clap, knowing that an encore is coming. Speaking of the Beatles, Ringo Starr just stops doing that. He just says, okay, I'm going to sit here for a few seconds. I'm not leaving. I'm going to come back and play encores. Before we get to the encore, though, I would be a remiss, Robert, if I did not give you the chance to tell listeners how they can find out more about Project Grand Slam, more about your podcast, more about your book. Where can they find you on social media to find out all this stuff?
Easiest way is I have two sites that are worth mentioning. One is for the podcast. It's just followyourdreampodcast.com. And the other is for the band, and it's also simple. It's projectgrandslam.com. And if anybody wants to send me an email, just send it to robert@followyourdreampodcast.com. I'll be happy to answer.
So, Robert, I just find what you do is inspiring. I mean, it's just not just that you've launched a band in your 60s, but it's your philosophy of daring to dream, and you have a plan and a methodology of how to do that, and you're not afraid. It's not, you could have said, Project Grand Slam, #1 Billboard, it's pretty successful. I'm good. I'm done. I'm living the dream. This is awesome. And that would be great. That would be stupendous, but it's when other dreams come along, you don't say, okay, no. I've got my dream. No more. I only need one. No, you're willing to say, okay, so let's try this whole podcast thing. Maybe I can help others follow their dreams later in life. Then it's like, oh, maybe there's a book that I can do. So it's being willing to listen to that inner voice that you now do. You don't ignore it. You flesh it out, come up with a plan, you try it. If it doesn't work, that's fine. I feel like you have a whole philosophy of nurturing dreams and being willing to see if they're going to happen, be willing to fail, that I think people need to learn from. So there might be listeners who they're in their second act, maybe they're over 40 or over 60 and they're listening. What would be a message of hope that you would give them as they're listening today?
First of all, thank you both for having me on. I really do appreciate it. I think we've said it together. You've said it just now. My mantra has been that you're never too old and it's never too late to follow your dream. And I am living proof of that. And I think there are many other people that are in that category. Give it your best shot. Okay. We only go around once in life. You don't want to have regrets. It's not about success or failure. As the saying goes, it's about the journey, not the destination. Okay. Keep smiling.
I have been in the communications business long enough to know when the last word's been spoken on a subject. I've also been a music fan long enough to know when Elvis has left the building. Both of those just occurred with Rogers. Listen to me. Both of those just occurred with the last statement from our guest. Listeners, thank you so much for spending time with us, not just on Beyond the Crucible, but also on our series, Second Act Significance. We're not done yet. There are more episodes to come. If you've heard something in this series that really has touched you, that really has motivated you, if you've begun your own second act yourself because of what you've heard, we'd love to hear from you. Go to crucibleleadership.com. You can click on a link there and you can send us an email, and we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, then, listener, that we are together for another episode of Second Act Significance here on Beyond the Crucible. Do remember that your Crucible experiences, we understand, Robert understands, Warwick understands, your Crucible experiences are painful. They're difficult. They can make you feel like some bad things have just happened to you, that you're just kind of stuck in a situation that is not fulfilling, that does not feel like it's bringing you satisfaction. But it's not the end of your story. As we talked about here, it can be the beginning of a new story once you learn the lessons of it, once you take some baby steps, as Robert talks about them. Warwick says, take one small step at a time. As you do those things, as you advance forward beyond your crucible, beyond that first act, beyond the intermission from the first act, and grab hold of your second act, you can end up at a place that's the most fulfilling of all, because that is a life of significance.